So we are here in a new episode of Late Night Anarchy with Daniel McCarthy to talk about election and what the victory of Trump could mean for conservatism. Daniel McCarthy is the editor of the American Conservative and has been writing and in some interviews saying very interesting stuff about the most recent election. How do you define this kind of moment that it seems like transcendental for the American right?
It really does. Thank you for having me on. And I think this moment is basically seeing a rejection of what might have been called right-wing globalism and a sort of reaffirmation of the nation state as an ideal. And exactly what that means is something that I think will take several months, perhaps years, to be fully fleshed out. But you've had a program which basically many Republicans, many people in movement conservatism in the United States have been pushing since the end of the Cold War in terms of global integration, in terms of the United States taking a very active role in trying to create an international order. A new world order, in fact, was the term that George H.W. Bush used in the 1990s. And that project has now gone out the window. I think what we now see is a more realistic approach to the world, one in which we recognize nation states, recognize sovereignty. We have our own interests, and obviously we wish to pursue those interests above those of other states. But we no longer have this idealistic and utopian view. And it seems to me that the American public has been losing confidence in that sort of world architectural order over the course of several years now, especially on the right. And that, you know, an early sign of this came in the 1990s with Pat Buchanan, who was already a critique of this kind of globalism back in 1992 and in 1996. And then, you know, in the decade or more since then, 20 years basically, you've seen other movements, whether it was Ron Paul or whether it was the Tea Party, which also had a sense of wanting to see Americans reject this kind of globalism of various kinds, whether it was multiculturalism, whether it was the idea that we would be trying to do nation building around the world. And trade was really one thing that wasn't on the radar for many people until very recently. But in fact, it seems to me that the American public, the American working class in particular, has been losing its confidence in free trade for a long time, and especially on the right. So even though Donald Trump symbolized a kind of immediate big change in these in the political establishment, I think the undercurrents have been there for many years.
Well, as someone who lives in Peru, and Peru was one of the countries that was supposed to sign the agreement, but I made an article. Actually, that article is in Spanish and sometimes write in Spanish and English. But the issue was that I consider, alongside with the Mises Institute, that I agree more or less with their thought that the TPP wasn't a free market agreement in the most pure sense of the word. It has some issues that some libertarians could think in some ways that could be positive, but the restrictions in intellectual property could make for example, health products being expensive, and it will be more complex. And I think it is a real shock. I like many was very surprised in the eve of the victory. Despite my biggest that I don't have any kind of positive feeling about Hillary. I was supposed that I wasn't thinking that all the pundits could be wrong, and I was wrong with that. But I think that this is a realignment that it's very complex, and I think that some people are speaking about a global movement, a global right, but I think that concept is has its limits, because I think that for example, the Ukrainian right is not happy with Trump. I don't think that they will be happy with someone that has sympathies for Putin, and the Ukrainian-Russian relationship will be very complex in that sense. And I think also here in Latin America, the right is not necessarily very happy. I know that, for example, in Brazil, there is a relatively large evangelical right, and and the Intercept has made an interesting point about they have made quite a small rally defending Trump, who was quite curious in Brazil, but I don't think that most parts of the Latin American right will sympathize with the kind of populism that Trump represents, because the Latin American right was a staunch defender of the Washington Consensus, um, or what it was called the neoliberal order that was for some take place in the 90s, and I don't know what are your thoughts for the limits of this new kind of populism.
Well, I think you're exactly right that this new populism it's global in the sense that it's happening simultaneously in many countries, but it's not global in the sense of necessarily uniting the different movements in different places. I mean, what you're seeing is a resurgence of the idea that nation states have distinct interests, and their governments should be serving those interests as opposed to the interests of a sort of global financial class or of a sort of abstract ideological global order. After the end of the Cold War, Irving Kristol, who was sort of the godfather of neoconservatism here in the United States, he said that basically, we are now a nation very much like the Soviet Union was, and that we are an ideological nation, that we have this mission that extends around the globe, and that we, in fact, have not only our own interests, but certain universal values that we embody and must express. Now, obviously, it gets very complicated because Americans are not, by electing Donald Trump, repudiating the idea that there are universal values, or repudiating the idea that there are international norms or what have you. But they're changing the way in which they see the relationship between their own country and the rest of the world. And I think they're saying that there are you can't integrate things easily into a single global order, and that it's important to have a degree of looking out for America's own interests, including the interests of the different classes within America, the working class, the middle class, which is really being squeezed right now, and not only the classes, but also the different regions, that in fact, the policies that are good for urban centers and cities, and especially for Wall Street and Washington, D.C., are not necessarily the policies that are good for rural areas and for so many other parts of the country.
Yes, I was thinking that this election has had particular effects on some parts of the right. For example, libertarians, that despite that a lot of them don't want to be identified with the right, I think for the large American public, or at least for the ones that have heard the war and some things, even vague concepts about it, relate them with the right, especially because of the Koch brothers being very important founders of Republican candidates. But I think this election is very curious. So one of the Koch brothers said that he was thinking in voting for Hillary. And for example, the people on Reason Magazine and Cato Institute have been very critical of Trump, much more than of Clinton, I think. I think that if one looks at 2012 or 2008, it's certainly that they were critics also of McCain and were critics of Mitt Romney, but some of them think that there would have been some kind of more establishment change, at least in certain tax cuts and certain even marginal changes in a libertarian direction, for put it in some way. But on the other hand, people like Justin Raimondo are still hopeful of a more America First foreign policy, that this could be the end of neoconservatism, that this could be a change in the way foreign policy is managed in America. And it's a very curious relationship, because it's very difficult to find someone in the middle. It's like at the two very radical positions.
Well, I think increasingly you are going to see a middle ground start to emerge between libertarians, for example, who've been very critical of Donald Trump, and those who have been rather more enthusiastic. So you're seeing John Allison, for example, who was formerly the president of Cato, is being mooted as a possibility for Treasury Secretary. And I think you're going to see across the board, and if you can also look at what's happening with the neocons as well, that they were staunchly anti-Trump. In fact, they were the sort of core demographic behind the Never Trump movement. They were magazine editors and think tank pundits and so forth who are most staunchly opposed to Donald Trump during the primaries and even during the general election. Nevertheless, a lot of those people, even someone like Mitt Romney, for example, they now seem to be coming around and saying maybe we need to look on the bright side and see what we can do with this Trump phenomenon. So I think you're going to see that across the board. And I think slowly you're going to have that emerging among libertarians. But it's not going to mean that there won't be libertarian criticisms that will be consistent and that will continue with regard to the Trump administration. So first of all, if someone like Justin Raimondo gets disappointed and our foreign policy turns out to be more in line with what we had under Bush and then under Clinton before that, under Trump once more, then I think you're going to see someone like Justin Raimondo become a very staunch critic of the Trump administration. And similarly, quite apart from something as dramatic as another Iraq war kind of situation, if you have the new administration adopt policies on torture or adopt policies on drone warfare that are contrary to libertarian principles on civil liberties and the rule of law, then you're going to see continuing libertarian criticism. And it could come from either direction. It could come from Cato. It could come from people with sort of LouRockwell.com and sites like that, or it could come from both. I think it's been very interesting that Justin Amash, for example, perhaps the most libertarian member of Congress right now, has actually been quite critical of Donald Trump since he became president-elect, and not in a kind of knee-jerk, sort of reflexive way, but in looking at policies and looking at practices and just saying, libertarianism does not cease to be valid simply because this election affirmed a populist and nationalist Republican leader.
Yes, I think it's quite complex to define from ideologically, but I was thinking I think that there is that this election is a big surprise, but on the other hand, I think that there have been some kind of candidates that have been very heterodox. For example, some weeks ago, I don't know, I had some time, so I was searching for videos in C-SPAN, and I found a video of a debate between Bob Conley of South Carolina, which was called a Ron Paul Democrat, and Lindsey Graham. And it was very curious because Bob Conley wasn't as libertarian as Ron Paul, but he was very anti-war. He was very staunchly anti-imperialist, and he was very critical. And on the other hand, he was on some infrastructure and some more issues with especially the more radical libertarians will oppose. He seemed to try to put a middle ground in some kind of way that he will be, but his position in immigration was very radical. I think he was more radical even than Donald Trump. But so I was thinking that if in the Democratic primary someone like that had been able to win a primary, it was a message that people wanted change, and in the South there are some conservative Democrats, but I think that even they understood that the foreign policy was in a bad direction, and that the trade deals were damaging the economy, and well, immigration is a curious question. I am more of a Rothbardian vein, but as someone who is from Latin America, the only country that has more or less open borders, which is Argentina, actually doesn't treat good immigrants. I mean, a lot of people put Argentina as an example where open borders work, but actually Argentina is a place where there is a lot of discrimination, where immigrants have a lot of problems in being integrated to the society. There are immigrant neighborhoods where they are separated by nationality. So it's not necessarily a case for too much. I don't know. I think that in that part, a lot of libertarians, especially libertarians and left libertarians, are more idealists in that regard, because I think even if one looks at Carhes, he was a very radical Rothbardian anarchist libertarian, but when he talked that communities should should be key in accepting those immigrants, because if not, that process of integration that was the problems that are happening in Europe will continue to happen in other places.
Well, I think that's right. A intelligent libertarian has to look at immigration not just as an abstract question of individuals moving across borders, but as a question of how does one system affect another, right? So, in the case of the immigration that we've seen in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been immigration which has been directed towards reinforcing basically the system, which gets called neoliberalism, but of course, in many ways, it diverges or deviates from the kind of true classical liberalism that Murray Rothbard, for example, would have championed. But the idea has been to import, a certain, a category of laborer in order to basically keep this structure going, keep this economic structure going, which has been very beneficial for Wall Street. It's been very beneficial for, sort of diversity coordinators on campuses and, any number of other specialized categories, but has not really been so good for, necessarily all of the American people, and especially in, fields like manufacturing, for example. So immigration can't be seen as just simply a matter of what is, just on an individual level or what is just on a sort of cosmic level. It has to be taken into account. How does this alter, or how does this reinforce, or how does this undermine political systems and even sort of cultural dynamics that are pre-existing within societies where you have an influx of immigration coming? In other words, immigration is not a politically neutral act. It's always something that tends to have a political dimension to it, and it tends to either support or undermine or transform the political system or the political culture that exists in a given place. And I think the American people, they still like immigration in the abstract. They still like the idea that, we will bring the most talented people, the hardest working people. We're happy to have them in America. We're happy for them to become American citizens. But we want them to obey the law, and we want them to come in an orderly fashion. We want we want the American people themselves to be the ones who set the limits on how many people come, how quickly. And all of that seems entirely fair to me. And it seems to me that the very hardline, extremely ideological position occupied by libertarians, for example, and by other open borders types is really quite unrealistic. And it's a kind of moral preening. It's a kind of way of demonizing anyone who says, well, let's simply take it slow. Let's simply be selective about the immigration we have. The libertarians and extreme open borders types will basically say, well, you're a bigot if you don't want to have absolute, complete open borders for everyone all the time, no matter what. It seems to me that you can actually have this middle ground. Most opponents of immigration are not, in fact, opponents of immigration entirely. They're critics of illegal immigration, or they're people who want to slow down the rate of legal immigration. But they're not people who believe that only the people who are already in our country and their offspring deserve to, be here forever and ever, amen. They're basically saying that, no, what we want is that the American people should have some control over who's coming and how in what volume and how quickly.
Well, the interesting fact is that sometimes neither libertarians, neither radicals on the left, for example, look at Bolivia, which was very curious that Evo Morales rejected the idea of receiving even one refugee from Syria. And it was kind of polemic. I think that there is certainly an issue with what is going to be, because sometimes here in Latin America, especially with the outs of Dilma and the new Temer government, the new Macri government, it has been told of a return of the right. But on the one hand, I think that there will be certainly, and I think Macri was very quickly to try to reach out to Trump, an attempt for the right to try to take an issue with their ideological proximity. But on the other hand, I think that it could backfire, because especially in Argentina, it's a very nationalist country, and I think a lot of independents, what in other countries will be independents, are people who have very nationalist inclinations, and the Kirchnerismo, as is called here, was born of a right-wing populism, and with the time it has moved to the left. But it's kind of a form of populism, and in Kirchnerismo there are some more conservative leaning people, especially in rural areas. But the issue is that this could backfire, because um, I think that probably with Peña Nieto also it could backfire, the issue that people were calling for him to reject Trump in a more radical way, and the funny fact is that it could make a more right wing party like the pre winning an election, but at least the pre was more critical of Trump in their own way. They're also nationalists of the right, and so it is very strange what Latin American relationship with Trump is going to be, and it's for me is still in part a mystery.
Well, and I think it's going to be the same around the world. I think Japan, for example, is thinking very carefully about, what it means to have Donald Trump in power in the United States. In Great Britain, the Theresa May government is also having to think very carefully about what this means. Donald Trump did a kind of unprecedented thing when he suggested that perhaps Nigel Farage should be, nominated as the ambassador to the United States. Normally, the country that's receiving an ambassador doesn't, express an interest or a preference in who the ambassador is going to be. And Theresa May, I think, is much more of a kind of she has seemingly been acting in good faith, and I think has been acting in good faith with regard to Brexit. The judges in Britain have now, created a complicated situation where Parliament basically has to vote to confirm what the referendum had already decided, namely that Brexit will go forward. But Theresa May, other than the Brexit question, I think she is much more of a I don't want to say a Bush-style conservative, but certainly a conservative who is more of an orthodox or known quantity than someone like Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is a very new phenomenon, and as you have mentioned, a populist who doesn't adhere to ideological formulas in a very predictable manner. So how someone like Theresa May is going to deal with Donald Trump, even with a relationship as close as that between the US and the UK, is very much in question. So I can certainly see that in Latin America and in East Asia and around the world, these questions become all the more difficult.
Yes, for going to the next point, I think that it's very interesting to talk about the right in different countries, because in someone thinks in communism, for example, a lot of countries have communist parties, and despite that now they have more ideological in certain ways, that it's true that some countries have, like France, have a communist party which has rejected Leninism, and it's more moderate in some ways. With conservatism, it doesn't happen in that way, because conservatism here in Latin America is very different than in the United States, and the conservatism in the United States is not the same as in France, and in France is not the same as in Russia. So it's quite very interesting. So I was wondering, what is your journey to the kind of conservatism that you, in which you could be defined now?
Well, I think it's been a rather consistent path that I've been on, because I first got interested in politics in the early 1990s. I was in high school, or in fact, at the very beginning, I was in middle school, and I became very interested in Pat Buchanan's efforts in around 1992. And Buchanan seemed to me to have a much clearer vision for America, and also a clearer vision of what he stood for in terms of principles than his competition either on the sort of neoliberal right, the George H.W. Bush, New World Order right, or on the Clintonite left. And I like the fact that Buchanan, not only had very clear stances on things like abortion, for example, and on cultural issues, but also when it came to American interests in trade and in foreign policy too. And in all those categories, I thought that Buchanan's program looked pretty attractive. And since then, I've plumbed the sort of intellectual foundations of Buchananism. I started reading Chronicles magazine, for example, in the sort of mid to late 1990s. And I became aware of the Rothbardians and the sort of paleo-libertarian cousins of the Buchananite paleo-conservatives. So I was reading them and writing for them occasionally in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then I joined the American Conservative magazine right as the Iraq War had begun. I think I joined the magazine in around October of 2003. And I was already very strongly opposed to the war. I had been a graduate student right before joining the magazine. And as a graduate student, I ran a campus publication that I founded and was already, that publication was very anti-war. It was conservative, it was on the right. It had many libertarian as well as conservative contributors. And it was pretty much, I wouldn't say uniformly anti-war, but it was certainly, sort of 3/4 or 4/5 anti-war. We were definitely very critical of neoconservatism, even as, sort of campus journalists and even at that level. And so I realized this was something that I believed in very strongly, and I wanted to take part in it, as my profession, not just as a sort of sideline to my studies. And so when a position at the American Conservative, a staff writer position, became available, that was something I tried out for, and I applied, and I got it. And since then, I worked at the American Conservative for several years. I took a break from the magazine. I went to Wilmington, Delaware. I worked for an educational conservative organization in their books publishing division, because basically I had been for a while at the American Conservative, effectively the literary editor. I was overseeing the books section, and I thought it would be interesting to try taking part in the other side of the books profession, publishing the books rather than reviewing them. So I did that for about a year, and then I got bitten by the the Ron Paul revolution bug in late 2007, early 2008, and I joined the Ron Paul campaign, presidential campaign, in January of 2008 as the official campaign blogger. And I did that sort of during the early months, through Super Tuesday and a little bit afterwards. And then I returned to the American Conservative after that. So I wish I could say there was more. I think perhaps the deepening and broadening of my ideological views have come from assimilating the elements of traditional conservatism and of even National Review conservatism, Cold War conservatism, that I discovered were compatible with and were part of the bedrock of some of these Buchananite somewhat nationalist, somewhat populist elements. And I also came to understand, I think, sort of how both libertarianism and traditionalism can enforce and reinforce and inform one another. That attempts to kind of sever traditionalism, moral conservatism on the one hand, and libertarianism and its critique of government on the other hand, and its acceptance of free markets. That if you try to keep those two things separate, you in fact wind up with very sort of over-refined and maladapted ideologies, and that in fact you have to have this conflict, you have to have this commerce of ideas, you have to have this sense of reconciliation, between these philosophical elements of the American right in order to have an effective American right. So what I see Trump as having done is he has blown up a formula that was not working, the formula that was sort of undertaken by the two Bushes and by National Review over the course of many years, and by Fox News as it had been for a while. And Trump has basically thrown the formula out the window, and he started to create a new formula which has many of the elements of Buchananism that I liked, but it really is a new formula, and it's very hard to say, or if it's a formula at all, which it isn't quite yet. But basically what Trump is doing is creating a very new kind of Republican Party, perhaps a new form of conservatism, a new form of American right. And I think that's very exciting. And even though you would think a conservative would be very critical of the idea of making something new to replace something old, the fact is that the conservatism, so-called, that we had over the last 20 years, this movement conservatism, was very defective. I mean, it had a very bad sense of foreign policy. It didn't really look out for the interests of the American public as a whole. And it was very much the ideology of a rather narrow class, a class of people who were really, especially those in think tanks, especially those in magazines. And basically it was serving, professional conservatives themselves, people who made their living as ideologues, more than it was serving any particular real concrete material interest or class interest or public interest of the country as a whole. So I wish I could say there was a bit more maybe dynamism and change and difference in my political philosophy over the years, but in fact it's been pretty consistent. I mean, over time it adds some libertarian components here or there, it adds some Cold War conservative components, it adds some realist components over time, but fundamentally it has been this at core a degree of Buchananism. I do think Buchananism has to, take account of the 21st century. I mean, America is indeed experiencing changing demographics. It's changed culturally tremendously since, sort of Buchanan was serving in the Nixon administration, for example. And so, when I see Donald Trump basically creating a truce on an issue like gay marriage, for example, I think that's a perfectly conservative thing to do. I think that basically trying to refight an old battle that had been lost would be counterproductive. And I think similarly trying to join with the left and, outdo the left in terms of transgender privileges or something like that would be crazy. That I think the American people want a truce in the culture war. They want a policy that, is not demonizing sexual minorities, but also isn't trying to coerce everyone else into sort of lauding and celebrating those identities. And I think, similarly, when it comes to race, when it comes to immigration and changes demographically, there again, I think there's a need for negotiation, which is one of the things I really like about Trump. There's this need to have, sort of clarity about different interests that different groups have and how those interests can be, served in a way that helps the nation as a whole. And, that's going to be, that's a transaction. That's something that's not amenable to a simple, formula, whether it's individualism or whether it's multiculturalism. Instead, it's something that has to be worked out again and again through a series of transactions and a series of, political and cultural efforts and sort of matchups. But that's good. That's politics, and I think that's what we are returning to.
Well, your Twitter handle says Tory anarchist, and you have written about conservative anarchism in the ideological.com. So you still consider yourself a conservative anarchist, and if so, in what way do you could define that ideology?
Well, Tory anarchism, I think, was, I think the term Tory anarchist was something Max Beerbohm was the first person to label himself in that way. And it's a riff on an even older idea, which is that sometimes what you need are Whig measures and Tory manners. And that phrase gets sort of reformulated in a few different ways. But the idea is that you can have many of the benefits of a fairly open society, while still also adhering to older codes and to a sense of respect for the history and for the sort of evolved culture of the place in which you live. So that's part of the core of what I mean by Tory anarchism. The other thing too is a sense that in many ways I'm a cultural, philosophical anarchist more than a political, practical anarchist. And what that means is that I think I can recognize that the state is always an extremely dangerous institution. And that doesn't mean you can get rid of it easily. It doesn't mean that you can get rid of it at all. It simply means that you have to acknowledge that it exists, and as long as it exists, no matter how nicely you write a constitution, no matter how carefully balanced the institutions of society may be, the state will always have the risk and the potential to escape its bonds and sort of tyrannize over all the other elements of society, not only the individual, but also the family, also the local community, also the business world. That the state is very easily an unrestrained institution, and therefore one psychologically and philosophically has to be prepared to resist the state and not simply say that the state. You never want to identify the state with society to such a point where you lose the ability to say that the state has overstepped its bounds and has gone too far and has trampled on the ancient rights of other institutions. So, again, I think philosophically, I think, as a sort of cultural ideal, what's perfect is not having a state, but, the world as it is unlikely ever to, reach that point on a large scale, which is interesting sort of in two ways. So I think practical anarchism really does have to look at small scale anarchism. I think that's an interesting question. What kind of, sort of local community can you have which does exist in a kind of minimal governmental system, or has, perhaps simply strong enough habits and traditions and a strong enough sort of social mores that it doesn't need laws. So I think that's one kind of practical ideal or semi-practical ideal, but it's a small scale ideal, it's a local ideal. Whereas when you have something large scale like the nation state, which exists for a number of historical and practical reasons, it's obviously anarchism and the nation state are sort of antitheses. So, and that's something where I see anarchism it doesn't clearly represent a large-scale practical approach that would replace the nation state. And I think efforts to do that, that's one of the things that neoliberalism tried to do, right? It tried to say, well, okay, maybe US power is expanding, maybe, you know, the European Union is a kind of hyper-government, but ultimately, you know, once we have liberalism, you know, fully enforced and we've destroyed all the rogue states, then we're going to have, you know, these last international institutions perhaps will melt away, and you will have true sort of anarcho-capitalism, or a kind of universal regime of human rights on the one hand and you know, free markets on the other. And I think that was always, you know, however noble that ideal might have been, and I might question whether it was a noble ideal, but however noble that ideal might have been, the process of getting there, much like the process of getting to the point that the utopia the communists dreamt of, involved a lot of violence, and it involved a lot of you know, of really crushing human beings in order to turn them into something that they aren't, and make them, you know, fit for a world that in fact they aren't really by nature suited for. So, and you know, neoliberalism wasn't, I don't want to compare it to communism in terms of the sheer, you know, sort of murderousness. Communism, you know, by many orders of magnitude is a much more evil system. But neoliberalism had that same sort of totalizing tendency. And I think that's one, you know, another reason to resist it. And in fact, that's one reason I would even say, as a sort of philosophical anarchist, I'm opposed to neoliberalism. So I think there are some people who would say there's a philosophical anarchist case to make for neoliberalism, namely that it's going to see, you know, the weakening or reduction of governments and the flourishing of individuals and, you know, sort of spontaneously created commercial institutions, etc. That's the, you know, anarchist case for neoliberalism. But my anarchist case against neoliberalism is the idea that in order to get to the world that you know, people dream of with neoliberalism, you first have to destroy the way that people actually live. And that's a serious problem, and something that really can't be accomplished unless you're willing to force your views on them.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because I think as someone who comes from the left and in some way became a libertarian more or less because of Karl Hess, because it was very influencing me. And I was very influenced also by the American conservative, and also by Justin Raimondo. And, well, I have been, and I think that on some issues, when I think, for example, in Karl Hess, and I go back to read him, he sounded in some ways like a proto Paleocom in some ways, because his mantra, in contrast to other libertarians, was a very deep love for his country. A love that one could see in any war that comes from his letters, especially in the New Left era. And it's very complex to describe that, because it seems that his love of his country was the reason for him to want to abolish the state, which kind of, in a sense, sounds contradictory, but in other sense sounds like the libertarian argument that the current American foreign policy is making America less safe, and it's perverting morally what should be of America. And I think I mean, for example, Elizabeth Nolan Brown is by no means a paleo-libertarian. She's probably the most iconic example of the cosmopolitan libertarianism but she has made interesting points about the FBI and child pornography. The FBI maintains sites of child pornography, and it's a very disturbing case, because I mean, why this institution? I mean, it's supposed to capture predators and things like that, but it makes no sense in the long term to invest the amount of agents and technical support for maintaining several child pornography sites. It really shows the perversion of the state, that sometimes it says that it exists to protect the weak, but a lot of times with the weak it abused it, and it's a very strange thing to describe.
Well, you know, I mean, it's one of the paradoxes of power, and you can see the same thing applies to anti-terror efforts. So one of the things, of course, that anti-terrorist law enforcement agencies do is they set up sting operations where they basically talk to people they think might have a potential to be radicalized or might already be radicalized, and they say, hey, would you like to buy a missile launcher? Would you like to buy some fertilizer to create an explosive to attack something? So there is this this kind of hazard. Is law enforcement effectively drawing out the elements that already exist and that would be dangerous, that would be supporting child pornography, that would be supporting terrorism, etc.? Is law enforcement drawing out those elements that already exist and exposing them and sort of bringing them in under arrest and prosecuting them, which everybody would want? Or is it in fact sort of instigating a market which otherwise would not exist or would exist at a much lower level? And this is, I don't think it's a clear-cut case. I think there's, it's very prone to abuse, which is why I think you need to have very strong oversight mechanisms. If you have the FBI, allowing or sort of keeping these child pornography sites or other things as bait, if you have sting operations being set up for terrorism, you have to be extremely, extremely careful that you are not, in fact, propagating the evil that you mean to be sort of exposing and then eliminating. But again, I think it would be wrong to impose a kind of ideological litmus test here and to say, well, here's my checklist for deciding, whether or not this operation is working correctly or working incorrectly. I think you have to have a prudential, approach. You have to apply judgment to these things. But like I said, I mean, one of the elements of anarchism and libertarianism that I think is very useful is this idea that the state, even when it means well, the state is capable of doing extremely dangerous, destructive, and counterproductive things. And there are many times, of course, when the state does not mean well. So one must always be on one's guard, and there always has to be vigilant oversight, ideally, by citizens, first of all, by the media, by the press, and also within government. You want to create sort of competing institutions and institutions that can have some degree of check on one another.
Yes, and I think it was interesting, Ron Paul, and I am a huge fan of Ron Paul, and one of my favorite moment in television was when Ron Paul was interviewed by Jay Leno, and after that, the Sex Pistols play Anarchy in the UK. It was kind of a poetic moment, I think. It was, and Jess Walker made an article about that Ron Paul was elected for the first time in Congress in 76, and that same year the Sex Pistols released the first record. So it is that kind of issues that make. I think that the Ron Paul movement was a very powerful element of trying to rethink American politics in a way, and it had a beauty. But I think that sadly, foreign magazines were very confused about Ron Paul. They didn't understood what's behind his anti-war conservatism. People didn't make sense. Some tried to not write about him because they didn't understand what he was saying. And it was a little bit sad, but the few articles that were relatively positive, Ron Paul has some fans even here in Latin America. And I think it's a very inspiring moment. And I think that he was, I think that as Brian Doherty put it in his article back in 2012, he was fairly to the right of Mitt Romney, but on the other side, he in practical terms were to the left of Obama on the war on drugs, on civil liberties, and foreign policy. And the issue was, it was very interesting because you could see that he was having a popularity among rural white voters, and also people like Juliette Lewis, the singer, or some rock bands that endorse him, or even a stripper that appeared on MSNBC saying that she was going to vote for him. It was kind of strange. Even Dennis Hoff of the Moonlight Bunch. It was a really strange combination. I mean, it was not. I don't think that Buchanan could have had this kind of combination neither of Donald Trump, but Ron Paul managed to have a combination of people of different ways of life, and in some sense even contradictory ways of life, but it seemed to be that movement walking in some path, but I think that Rand Paul moderation made libertarianism go in a more um, make libertarianism weak, because I think that what made libertarianism interesting for a lot of Americans was its radicalism, and I think with Rand Paul trying to triangulate in some way his way to winning the primaries, he lost that.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to what you say. Basically, in the 2008 and 2012 elections, Americans were across the board, whether they were on the left or on the right, were very sick of the George W. Bush administration and what it had produced. But they also, I think, did not want to return to the idea that the Clintons or the Kerrys, someone like John Kerry, that they were the alternative to the Bushes, because basically, that would be changing the label, but not really changing the product, right? That in fact, the degree of continuity between Bill Clinton and George W. Bush was pretty high. And John Kerry in 2004, even though he was critical of much of what Bush was doing, Kerry had also been a supporter of the Iraq War, and it would not have made a tremendous difference if he had won instead of Bush to the ordinary American. So I think in 2008, what you saw was that Americans on both the left and the right began to reject the standard formulas and to look for new ideas and new approaches to politics that didn't have the sort of systematic errors that both the Clintons and the Bushes had. So on the left, what you saw was that Barack Obama defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2008 Democratic primaries. That basically Clintonism and what Hillary Clinton stood for was beaten by the idea of hope and change. And on the right, you saw that even though Ron Paul didn't win the nomination either in 2008 or in 2012, nonetheless, he changed the way many people, not only on the right, not only Republicans, but also just people who may have been politically apathetic, may not have voted before. He changed the way a number of people on the right and in the center, and some on the left as well, thought about politics and thought about the Republican Party, thought about the things that were possible in politics. And I think that had a long-term effect. And there is an interesting question here as to whether, if you had a younger Ron Paul instead of someone like Rand Paul, who was running on a very radical platform in 2016, would that person have done better in the Republican primaries than Donald Trump did? And I think it's an open question. As you pointed out, Ron Paul seemed to have at least the potential of building a kind of left, right, and center coalition that was something totally unseen in American politics. Whereas I think you're correct that both Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump, even though they had elements that did cross over with some of the left, especially the labor left, and certainly they had elements that appealed to the sort of the silent majority and the sort of Nixonian middle, they were fundamentally movements of the right. And so the question would be, would a sort of younger Ron Paul have been an even stronger contender than a kind of populist of the right like Donald Trump? And I genuinely don't know. And it seems to me it's an important question, despite the fact that we had the election outcome that we had, and that Trumpism is now the future for the next many years, because libertarianism is not going away. That in fact, millennials in particular, to the extent they are interested in the right or interested in things that are not traditionally seen as being part of the left, many of them are interested in libertarianism. So there will be some sort of libertarian future on the right. And I think there's an open question as to what that will be, and whether it will integrate well with other elements of the right, or whether it will sort of try to build bridges with the left instead, whether you'll get libertarianism as millennial libertarianism, or whether you'll get a kind of virtue libertarianism as millennial libertarianism. And I certainly would favor the latter approach. It seems to me that libertarianism always needs to reconnect with the kind of historical and moral foundations that made it possible in the first place, instead of trying to join with the extremely progressive left and saying, well, these foundations should be thrown away along with the abuses that they were prone to, and you should make something entirely new. So, I think libertarianism has a future, but I think you're quite right that Ron Paul libertarianism has a future in a way that other kinds maybe do not. I should defend Rand Paul a little bit, because I do think, he had a sensible approach. He basically said if the American people were given a choice between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, they might very well choose Rand Paul. And I think that was the formula, that was the analysis he was looking at as he got into the race, and that's how he expected things to shake out. That it would come down to sort of Jeb Bush versus Rand Paul in terms of who would have the more sensible centrist approach. And if you look, in fact, at Hillary Clinton's some of the internal memos that got leaked, the Clinton team were very, very worried about Rand Paul. They saw him as perhaps the most formidable Republican they were dealing with. Rand Paul seemed to be someone who could, more or less unite the Republican Party, except for the neocons. He was someone who didn't seem crazy. He was someone who seemed like a nice mainstream guy, but who also had this futuristic libertarian element that other libertarians did not have, that might appeal to millennials, that might undercut the Democrats and the Hillary Clinton coalition in that regard. So I think that Rand Paul's approach had a very strong logic behind it. However, the electorate was much more feisty this year. I mean, they looked at Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, and they said, what is the most anti-Jeb Bush candidate we can possibly nominate? And Rand Paul, because he seemed sensible, he seemed moderate, he seemed, sort of middle of the road in some ways, they saw him as a fresh voice, yes, but they didn't see him as being quite as radical a change as Donald Trump clearly represented. So they decided to go for the most radical change they could opt for, which was Donald Trump. And then when we came to the general election, I see in some ways, in a paradoxical way, the 2016 election is in part a vindication of Barack Obama in a weird way. Because basically what it says is that hope and change really is what the American people want. They kind of think that Barack Obama didn't deliver that, but they have not decided that after 8 years of Obama, what they now want is to sort of repudiate Obama by going back to the choice they had in the Democratic primary in 2008 and voting for Hillary Clinton. What they basically said is, no, Obama was right. Clintons are, the past. You can't go back to that. And, since they were given a choice between Trump and Clinton, they went with Trump. They went with the future. They went with something that is a clear repudiation of the Bushes and the Clintons. And just as they had done, in 2008 and in 2012, when they chose Obama over Clinton first, and then Obama over McCain and Romney. The American people have wanted, profound change in their political system because they've looked at the political system, they've looked at what it's delivered, and they see it's delivered a great recession. They see it's delivered an endless series of wars in the Middle East. They see it's delivered, manufacturing jobs that have been leaving the country, even as you have low-skilled immigration coming in. And the American public has looked, and they've looked at their universities, they looked at what their children are being taught, they looked at, the sort of attacks on, traditional Western knowledge and so forth. The proliferation of multiculturalism and these ever sillier expressions of, sort of personal sexual identity and so forth. And the public said, you know what, this has gone a little bit too far. We actually want to get away from all of that and embrace something different, and maybe embrace something, sort of more transactional and a more normal kind of politics, as opposed to an ideological and utopian brand of politics with the Bushes and the Clintons.
Yes, I agree with that. And my question is now, what do you think about the argument that this has been made that if Bernie would have won the primaries, he would have beat Trump?
Yeah, I don't know whether he would have beaten Trump, but I think it would have been a much more interesting race. And I think Trump and Sanders would have had to match wits and match policies when it came to foreign policy, when it came to the economy and so forth. So I think it would have been a better race. I think that America still would have been more eager to take a right-wing politician, someone who's of the right, but who also has appeal to the sort of middle-class and working-class center, especially in the Rust Belt. I think they would have taken Trump over Bernie Sanders. I think Trump still would have won. But I do think it would have been a more interesting race, and it may have been a closer race as well.
And you have talked about libertarianism, but what about the kind of I know that the kind of left libertarianism of the C4SS maybe not be mainstream in any way. But for example, I knew a guy which is Peruvian, but in parts live in England, and so he usually writes in English. And the issue is that he, despite it being a left libertarian, he writes for Mises, for Mises.com. And I think that left libertarians in some way, and to a certain degree, I guess that some patterns, I will be a left libertarian in some sense. Have especially a lot of interest in Carhes, and when one searches in Carhes, it encounters certain conservative elements. I think Carhes, it's in one of the videos, I think it's on C-SPAN, in which Carhes called the libertarians to forge an alliance with the radical right, especially the radical Christian right. And he says that if someone thinks that his main allegiance is to God, he should think that his main allegiance is not the state, and that's why. And it was very honest. I mean, he that kind of case hasn't been made, and I don't. And why does this kind of left libertarianism, at least in the United States, don't exist anymore? Because it was a left libertarianism different than Sheldon Richman or Roderick Long or I don't know, or others that go to the Center for a Stateless Society. And I think that in some ways it's closer to the positions of Jess Walker, but on the other hand, Jess Walker on other issues maybe sound more moderate than Carhes. Why this kind of left libertarianism disappeared?
Well, it's a very good question. I think Karl Hess is very hard to characterize ideologically. Certainly, he's a libertarian, but is he a left libertarian? Is he a kind of, I mean, you may have seen in an early issue of the American Conservative, we had an interview with Norman Mailer, where Norman Mailer called himself a left conservative. In some ways, I think the most accurate description of Karl Hess might be a left conservative libertarian. So. Yeah, I think there is something like that, and there is a kind of nice all-Americanness to that, and not all-American in an exclusive way, but in a way that it is something that is it's almost a cowboy mentality, right? It's a kind of, and not the cowboy mentality that Europeans think of, for example, where you're just reckless and against stuff, but it's the idea of being a frontiersman, the idea of sort of taking people as they are, not trying to transform them into something they're not. And this idea of, and self-sufficiency as well, and independence, and the idea that you create a homestead and so forth. And I think, Karl Hess, he took that quite literally. So he moved to West Virginia, for example. I mean, you know the story, and I'm just relating this for our viewers. But he created a house that was basically self-sufficient. I think he did a lot of the building on it himself. He did, I think he put up solar panels and other things. So he was someone who took very seriously this ethos of libertarianism that's lived in a way that's leads itself towards independence of spirit and self-sufficiency, and not simply being corralled into some system. Now, is that something that can be generalized? Is that something that can be turned into a movement? I don't know that it can be. I think you're right that Jesse Walker represents maybe something that's spiritually akin to that. Jesse Walker is not, not as radical in some ways as Karl Hess was, but clearly he has the same sort of cultural affinities in some ways. I think Bill Kaufman would be another good example.
Yes.
Kaufman is, maybe a little bit right-leaning in his perspectives, but he fundamentally also has kind of that Karl Hess heart to him. So it's a character type more than it is a political movement, I think, and it's a character type that maybe had more. Was more apt to express itself in the 1960s and 1970s, when there was all this cultural ferment and all this idea of sort of the greening of America and the breaking away from sort of established structures of the left and the right, breaking away from the state and sort of, trying to create a fresher, cleaner kind of, way of living. And I think, I'm a little younger than that. I'm from Generation X. I'm from the punk generation, basically. I thought it was a very interesting thing you said about Ron Paul getting into Congress, the same year that God Save the Queen came out by the Sex Pistols. And, so I think for my generation, there is a more sort of disillusioned view, perhaps, than you found with Karl Hess. There's more of this sense of, there's a darkness in life that is ineradicable, and there are trade-offs, and you're not going to be able to get away from the evils of the world by creating a kind of self-sufficient homestead. And that, yes, there's a lot to be said about the small-scale agricultural life that's noble and good, but in fact, the small-scale agricultural life is still subject to the vicissitudes of human nature and of what might just be called suckage, to use a kind of punk term. So that's my sense of why that character type perhaps doesn't exist as much now as it did then. I think there's less idealism in the world than there was when Karl Hess was sort of finding his way.
Yes, and I generally describe myself as a left libertarian. I sometimes, and actually in the podcast that I did with Jess Walker, I said it that in some ways for moments I consider myself a left wing political libertarian, and that definition, I mean, living here, the issue was that as someone who was opposed to obviously the more authoritarian aspects of the left, like the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru army that were kind of orthodox Marxists in their, and they had several elements, and on the other hand, being born in the Fujimori years were a very authoritarian right. I was very influenced by music, and I actually rock music create since I was in elementary, my vision of politics, and I guess that for that reason I consider myself on the left for a long time, and then to a certain degree I still consider myself on the left. But when I discovered Karl Hess, I had been reading Michel Foucault, and I was very interested in the Foucaultian critique of centralized power, and it seems like Karl Hess was the right answer, and I read more things about libertarianism. I found Rothbard and a lot of the people from the New Left, and the kind of coalition that they made in some way. But I was when I started to read the American Conservative and antiwar.com, I also was very influenced by that. But also I remember that while I was in studying philosophy here in Peru, in the National University of San Marcos, the most ancient university in the American continent. It's a very left-wing university, and it's a university where there are a lot of communists. I mean, sometimes people said that in American college they are communists, but actually there were people defending Stalin and Mao and things like that. No, so they were real communists, not fake communists like the ones that sometimes the right-wing pundits on Fox News try to create. But the issue is that I had two conservative professors they were kind of interesting because they didn't think much about the conservative tradition in the country itself, but more or less they were critics of the most liberal aspects of the of of the left, and it was very critical, interesting because they were very critical of the human rights promoters, and it was a very interesting critic that I know listen actually from the left, because organizations like Human Rights Watch in Colombia were very critical of the peace deal, and these left wings, this left wing podcast, the Chocolate Drop House, they interview Chase Mather, and he was making the case that actually the Human Rights Watch is in the Rockefeller Center, and the guy who directs this is a graduate for Yale Law School, and he says that he is not someone who is an expert in Colombia. So, I mean, his expertise are other things, but this kind of elitist idealism is what makes people in other places want to take decisions that they don't, that the people there are not necessarily in agreement, to say in some way. So I think that the critique of liberalism is very important, and I think that now people are talking about Legutko, the Polish philosopher, and his argument seems a very interesting argument. I think that there should be a critique of democracy, and I think that sadly it is very complex to formulate, because um, academia is still a place that has a lot of set of ideas, and especially in its relationship with the state, that makes a place of control rather than of an open discussion.
Yeah, I mean, you had brought up Foucault earlier, and I think one of the key things for not just for libertarians and anarchists to consider, but for conservatives and really for the left as well, is on the one hand, there's the state, which is a very dangerous institution, no matter even in the best of worlds. But there's also power is not just about the state. Power can be embedded in a lot of institutions, in a lot of practices, in even just in psychological sort of components of the individual psyche. And all of those things should be subject to vigilance. And I think it's a mistake, and it's a mistake I think some on the left make, to have a systematic approach that says, well, we know exactly how to get rid of all these sort of elements of power that are restraining the individual, or that are restraining the goodness in human nature in general. I think it's wrong to think that you have the answer to the problem, because in a way, the problem is humanity itself, right? So it doesn't have an answer. Instead, I think being aware of the difficulty is the key thing. Being aware of the abuses to which all institutions are prone, being aware of the dangers that they pose, and the benefits that they may offer in terms of balancing one another out. And that makes life a complicated thing. It means that you can't, as you'd mentioned, you can't have a human rights group based in the Rockefeller Center in New York City decide how it's going to look at conflicts in Latin America and resolve them. That in fact you actually have to deal with the people on the ground, with the realities, and it's going to be messy, and you're going to come up with solutions which to an abstract observer from Mars or from New York City might look like an injustice or something that's not being done properly. But the people who are actually engaged in a relationship are the ones who know how it can work out, and what its risks are, and what its possible solutions are. So that's there's I think a skepticism, as well as anarchism, libertarianism, and conservatism. All of these things, these are terms that apply to a mixture of ideas, not all of which overlap entirely, but some of which overlap partially. And I think all of them have to do with this critique of excessive rationalism, and this critique of liberalism in particular, with its tendency towards excessive rationalism. So one of my favorite conservative philosophers is Michael Oakeshott, who has precisely this kind of critique of approaching politics as if it were a cookbook, or as if it were something that's to be programmatically determined, rationally determined, rather than determined by the practice itself. David Hume, I think, is also a very useful philosopher to consult here. And he's someone who gets claimed by people who consider themselves liberals, which is fair enough. There are liberal elements to Hume. But he's also someone who I think is deeply conservative in his skepticism about the ability of reason to sort of provide its own foundations, and that in fact he's quite right to understand that the passions, and not just the passions, but also the historical context, and sort of the evolutionary tendency within our history, that these are the things that supply the texture of our lives, and that they're actually the primary things to which reason acts as a handmaid, as opposed to the other way around.
Well, for going to the last topic, I mean, a lot of people, even on the left, I think, that are aware of the American conservative. So what is the story of the American conservative? Because I think that this magazine, which has a more thoughtful analysis on the broad spectrum, I think it has a very interesting take on American politics, and in a lot of I know that not necessarily it always talks about international relations, but the times that it talks about international relations, it's also very thoughtful. So how was born the American conservative?
Well, back in 2002, as the Bush administration was gearing up for the Iraq War, the founders of the magazine, which were Taki Theodorakopoulos, Pat Buchanan, and Scott McConnell, they all recognized that there was in fact a broader opposition to the war effort than was commonly realized. So it was not simply limited to people who might be called Buchananites, to people who might be seen as being, on the kind of hard cultural right, that in fact there were a number of realists, a number of people like although she couldn't really publicly come out and oppose the war at the time very vociferously. But someone like Jean Kirkpatrick, for example, there were a number of people who were considered more mainstream than some of the intellectuals like Paul Gottfried, perhaps, who were around Buchanan, who were also opposed to the Iraq War. So the idea from the start was to bring these elements together, to have the elements, you could have a libertarian like Justin Raimondo, you could have libertarians at the Cato Institute, people like Christopher Preble. You could have Catholic conservatives who had military experience, people like Andrew Bacevich. You could have someone like Pat Buchanan, who represented the hard right. You could have a broad coalition of thinkers and people who were really at the top of their fields as journalists or as academics and members of think tanks, who all had a shared vision of a world that was more realistic as opposed to ideological, utopian, and militaristic. And so I think that was the core, beginning of the American conservative, was the fact that it started out with a Buchananite foundation, but the idea that the Buchananite foundation, the Buchananite core, actually had a mainstream component as well, and that it should actually be broadening itself and reaching out to these other elements which were simpatico, but had not, sort of fully expressed themselves hitherto. So the American conservative has always, tried to be both broad-minded. We've occasionally had people from the left write for us. You mentioned Chase Madar earlier, for example, but also, have core conservative concerns as well, represented by someone like Pat Buchanan. You see on the blog now that we have people like, on the website, you have Daniel Larison, who is, a relentless foreign policy critic from a, sort of very conservative perspective. You see someone like Rod Dreher, who has, a great many things to say about, social issues and generally the drift of American culture and society. But then you also have people like Noah Millman, who come from, a sort of pragmatic, centrist point of view. I think Noah, sometimes gets misperceived as being somewhat of the left, but he's really, very much a center, and in some ways even a center-right kind of figure. But all these categories that, sort of constrain the way people think and what they say, and how they can interact with one another, whether it's left and right, whether it's conservative and liberal, whether it's, sort of minarchist and anarchist, all of them should only be taken as far as they're useful, and they should be abandoned when they get to be counterproductive, and when they actually prevent you from having interesting discussions and prevent you from, sort of building the kinds of coalitions that you need in order to change policies that are just disastrous, whether those are foreign policies or economic policies or anything else. So the American conservative has tried to be dynamic, thoughtful, self-reflective to some degree, in a way that I think too many other outlets have become sort of ideological, monolithic, and they have their party line and they don't want to ever, sort of go beyond it or question it. So, and we've been lucky, of course, that we happened to be right from the beginning. When it came to the Iraq War, we, most of our criticisms were on the nose. And so that's helped a lot as well. I think that, while I emphasize this sense of the American conservative as a sort of wonderful dinner party where guests are all very interesting and they have their own stories and you get a wonderful conversation and interchange and exchange going, I think there's also this other component of the American conservative, which is that we are actually a better guide to politics, a better guide to policy, and a better guide to, the right approach for, certainly for the United States and perhaps for the international community as well, than most of our rivals on either the left or the right.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think it was very interesting because the American conservatives, especially the American conservative readers, had a lot of appreciation for Jim Webb, which has been on the last weeks because of the event that the American conservative host. I watched the video online, so it was very interesting, the remarks that Jim Webb had made, and actually he sounded a lot like Janis, the former finance minister of Greece, that calls himself a libertarian Marxist, curiously. And I think that it was a very interesting analysis. I think that probably the reason why the Democratic Party lost is because it has abandoned the white working class in order to pursue an agenda of identity politics, and it actually Ron Ants I think made the argument in an article some time ago about college admissions that actually college admissions were disfavorable, and actually it's like the James Webb argument that college admissions, especially for poor whites from Appalachia, were much more complex for a poor white on Appalachia to access college than from a guy from India. So there are these kind of issues that I think Jim Webb was certainly on track in trying to find where the problems have been. But on the other hand, I sometimes think that the problem is that the Democratic Party has been in a lot of ways dogmatic, and sometimes it's like parody. Sometimes when one is in Twitter, there are some Hillary supporters that call Bernie Sanders a white supremacist, and it's very curious that a Jewish socialist who backs a black Muslim to be the chair of the DNC is going to be a white supremacist because he doesn't agree on all issues in identity politics. I think on some issues Bernie has adopted more of these positions, but I actually think that for example, David Marinos, which is a Facebook friend of mine, the former presidential candidate of the Socialist Party back in the 80s, when I read some of what he writes, he sounded almost a Paleocon because he's from another generation. It was the most important was the class issue. It was not racial relationships, and the Socialist Party played an important role. I mean, some socialists associates Martin Luther King, but their issue was not race per se. Was class and the exploitation of the working class was their central issue. So it is a moment of various complexities for the left to try to rethink itself, and I think if the left could try to understand in some way what Jim Webb is saying, it could be very healthy.
That's right. I thought it was very interesting during the Democratic primaries that you had at one point 5 candidates on stage, and 2 of them were former Republican senators. Jim Webb was a Democratic senator, but he had been formerly a Republican member of Ronald Reagan's cabinet, Secretary of the Navy, back during the 1980s. And then you also had former Senator Chafee, who had been a Republican senator and was in fact the only Republican in the Senate to vote against the Iraq War. He also was running in the Democratic primary for president this year. Now that was interesting because it shows that the Democratic Party had this opening quite recently for people who had previously identified as Republicans to come over and join the Democratic Party, broaden the Democratic Party, strengthen the Democratic Party, and make the Democratic Party perhaps electorally invincible. But I think people like Chafee, and especially people like Webb, they were made to feel unwelcome within the Democratic Party. And in Webb's case, it's because Webb did not bend his knee to the platitudes of multiculturalism and so forth. And Webb had a class-based politics that really didn't work for the kind of Goldman Sachs, sort of class-based politics of someone like Hillary Clinton. And Bernie Sanders is an interesting case because, as you mentioned, throughout the Democratic primary, we had these, really nasty attacks on Bernie Sanders from Hillary Clinton supporters, where they basically tried to revoke Bernie Sanders' credentials as a left-winger because they said he didn't have enough black people voting for him, or that Sanders was his model of socialism was too similar to Scandinavia, too white, which was ludicrous. The left was basically the Clintonite left, I should say, and whether or not it should really be called a left, I don't know what it should be called other than just Clintonite and sort of the Goldman Sachs view of the world. But certainly the globalist sort of left, they really wanted to destroy this sort of class-based economic idea of the left that Bernie Sanders represented. They hated it when Jim Webb represented it in a kind of way that might have reached out to the right, and they hated it when Bernie Sanders did it in a way that was very clearly directed at the left. And they paid a price because the American people as a whole, they care much less about transgender bathroom issues. They care much less about some of these who's going to be the first woman or the first black person to get X, Y, or Z. Those things are trivial compared to the basic bread and butter issues of, do I have a job? Can I afford a mortgage? Is my health insurance going to go up this year? Can I, is it going to be putting me into poverty? If my daughter needs to get surgery, is that something we can afford? these kinds of core issues of just, taking care of the people of your own country had been disregarded by the Clintonite left as well as by the sort of George W. Bush, Mitt Romney right. And of course, you remember Mitt Romney writing off 47% of the American public as being, sort of just takers. And Trump didn't do that. And you saw, very interesting, I thought, during the general election campaign, that Trump, in fact, reached out to Bernie Sanders supporters at various times and said, rather nice things about Bernie Sanders. And it was very clear that Trump understood that middle America, the working class, and places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, that these were going to be the places that on which the election would turn. And he was exactly right. I mean, he had a brilliant entrepreneurial political vision in that regard.
Yes, and I think the sad part is the defeat of people like Russ Feingold, which I think would have been of great. Russ Feingold was probably the most anti-war of the Senate Democrats in a generation, and it was very sad. And actually, Ralph Nader has made a case, and I think people on the very conservative probably will be also more friendly to Ralph Nader. That, for example, Barack Obama could have campaigned harder for Mark Udall, which was in a close race, and he was probably one of the most valuable Democrats. He was he was more of a civil libertarian than others, and he was very interesting in many ways. And I think that loss of Feingold is really sad, and I think that it would have been interesting to see Marco Rubio lost, because he's a hawkish. I don't know much about Patrick Murphy, but at least I suspect that he wasn't as hawkish as Rubio, and these Senate races have been very critical to the destiny of American politics. On the other hand, Nikki Haley lost, and the senator from Nevada is relatively. I don't know. I guess that she is more of a centrist, but the senator from Illinois, if I am not wrong, Tammy Duckworth, is relatively anti-war, and I guess that maybe there could be some changes in this Democratic Party, that the defeat of the most warmonger wing of the party could bring a little bit of change to the face of the Democratic Party.
Well, that would be a nice thing if it happened. Unfortunately, with Chuck Schumer as the leading Democrat in the Senate, that's not likely to happen. I think Schumer is actually going to be as hawkish as almost any Republican on a great many issues. The Democratic Party, I mean, it really does have, it's facing an existential crisis, not only on the question of whether it can embrace working class issues instead of issues of multiculturalism and personal identity, but also in terms of where it stands on something like foreign policy. I think, again, Trump was brilliant and entrepreneurial and recognized something that he personally believed, but also something that was a political opening, namely that if someone on the right, like himself, in the Republican primaries, criticized Jeb Bush and George W. Bush for the Iraq War and these disastrous military misadventures, that in fact the public would respond favorably and would support him. We haven't seen Democrats who've had that same degree of courage, and I was disappointed, in fact, that Bernie Sanders was much more muted in his criticism of Hillary Clinton's support for the Iraq War and her hawkish foreign policy than Donald Trump was in criticizing Jeb Bush. And I think Sanders kind of let himself and his side down by failing to make a sharper critique. So it's not clear to me who right now are the leading sort of anti-war voices among Democrats and the left in America. And I do worry because during the Barack Obama years, when Obama did numerous militaristic things, whether in Libya or whether with his drone wars, or getting right up to the line in Syria, generally, except for the Syria episode, you didn't have a very well-organized anti-war left opposing Obama on these questions. That the anti-war left that existed during the Bush years melted away as soon as Barack Obama became president. Now the question is, are you going to see an anti-war left shape up again with someone with a Republican in office, Or are you going to see the left now do what Republicans did in the 1990s? Republicans in the 1990s simply made everything personally about Bill Clinton. And so instead of sort of deepening their opposition to things like the Kosovo War, they simply, explored things like impeachment and, the Whitewater investigation and so forth, and things that were narrowly directed against the person of Bill Clinton. I had thought you were going to see the reemergence of a more civil libertarian and anti-war left with Donald Trump as the Republican president. But I'm now starting to think, based on some of these silly protests that you've been seeing since the election, that in fact the left is completely, incompetent and is simply going to, rage against Donald Trump as a personality, or rage against, this myth that he is some sort of fascist or, extremist, and that they're not going to actually organize on, real issues, whether it's foreign policy or, for that matter, economics. So I think the left could be out of power for a very long time if they make that mistake.
Yes. Well, I think that with that we will leave there. And thank you for being here. It was a very interesting conversation, and I think people will follow you at Tory Anarchist on Twitter, and who read what you write and and the American Conservative. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on. This was wonderful.